Alright guys, talking about React components, then the introduction to it and what they are and how we're going to use them and why React is such a lean library that's just, its one focus in mind is UI, component based UI. Alright, so what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at, let's see my topics here, components, functional versus class components, also stateless components versus stateful, and then React's mighty props. Talk about that quickly. So components. All right, so we're talking about the component tree. So React components usually we want to basically envision a UI tree. So a single view of UI is divided into logical pieces. So if we look at, say, Facebook, we can envision that each component there, each piece is a component. We have the navigation pane. We have the profile. We have the feed, right? That could be a feed component. Inside of that, it'll be nested child components, reusable components. We may have like a story or some kind of thing we share, right? That could be a component. Inside of that, a text messaging or comment with a like button. All those things are all smaller components. So we tend to look at it like a component tree, and the components become branches or sub branches. That's how we represent it. So on the left, you can see the browser, and on the right, we can see how we might build a UI tree, similar to like a DOM representation, document object model, but we're talking about now component trees within React. So we want to talk about React components and basically know that, again, it's a component-based architecture. Every component is required to have a render method. We already talked about that. So we need a render method, whether it's a functional component, needs to return and render some JSX. Otherwise, the class component needs to also render and render some JSX as well. So that is what basically a component is. We have some logic in there, and we have to output something for the DOM. So the render method renders the component on the DOM. We basically use the component name and the DOM ID as arguments, and the HTML that again isn't. We already talked about that. We already talked. HTML isn't actually HTML. It's that syntactic sugar. It's called JSX, which is the representation of HTML with JavaScript that we believe we're doing HTML like code, but in fact it's syntactic sugar that will be transpiled down into React create element. So React takes these JavaScript objects and will form the virtual DOM. All right, we already talked about the virtual DOM. It's basically a copy of the real DOM, and it does some reconciliation, and it does some basically will figure out and compute the difference and only update the nodes that need to be updated instead of tearing down the DOM tree. We already talked about that. Just to recap. So basically, we have here where we have the root element, which is always very big. We need that root element, and the renderer will just take that code and just slam it right in that root element. Not slam it, it'll render it, right? It'll mount it. So we want to talk about components, right? Because we talked about JSX. We remembered that it needs to be capitalized. So one note there is that this is a functional component. So you can see it just reminds you of pretty much a basic function. JavaScript function, we just have a constant. We have some type of arrow function that takes a parameter. In this case, it's called props, which is built into React. And we have a return, so it's expecting to return something. But this is just a JavaScript function they're used to writing, but in the context of React, it's something more. It's a component. In order to signify a component, it needs to be Pascal cased, which means it needs to have a capital on the initial word. Otherwise, it can be confused because in this scenario, button, if you try it when it compiles down, it's already a keyword already in HTML and JavaScript, right? So you need to actually signify it's a component. It can be two types, can be class or functional component. Functional components are just JavaScript functions. They take an input parameter named props, and functional components are considered stateless. They don't have any state by default. Traditionally, if you need state, you need to use class components, which was a bit of a knock, although the newer versions of React have a solution to that, something called hooks, which are really nice. One thing to note about functional components is because they are JavaScript functions, they can be very small. They're meant to be reusable, and they're very easy to test with such testing libraries as Jest and Enzyme is the latter, and then now React testing framework. So they're really good for unit testing, integration testing, and these types of things. So where possible, try to do a functional component because well, it's actually a lot less code to be honest. And if you're just worrying about rendering a UI, some small piece, opt for functional component. Class components. So they offer more features, right? But they have more baggage. So primary reason to choose this kind of class component over functional is it has state. Class components are considered stateful. Why are they stateful? Okay, so if we are looking back at ES6 classes that we learned. We know that basically, again, it's not really a class. It's a syntactic sugar that'll be transpiled back down to JavaScript's prototype inheritance. But nonetheless, we have the concept of class, and we have the concept of superclasses, and superclasses can be derived into child classes. So if we can think of this as a class component, we use this extend keyword, and the parent or super class would be React.component. And inside of React.component, we have a lot of these things that allow us to have state. Probably on the next slide. I'm just kind of probably working ahead. So right, there's two ways to create a component. We can do React.create class, or we can extend React.component. The latter is probably more common, to be honest. So as you can see on the right there, we have a hello extends from React component. It has this constructor. When we call super, just by using classes, we know that super will call this React.components constructor and pass in the props. That's just good design. This render method, it's a method, it's inherited or from React.component. It's overwritten now because we're overriding. The concept of overriding applies. So we are overriding. There's a bunch of methods there that come with it that we're allowed to override or implement. So basically, that's why we would use a React component, because it comes with a lot of different things that functional components don't have out of the box. So, but you can also just can have no state. You can just say, hey, I like class components and I'm going to use the syntax. It's a lot more syntax, but I don't need to use state. You can do that. Best practices is, yep, you should always call the super with props. Constructor is optional if there's no state. However, when you use the constructor, super must be used and it's not optional. So basically saying when you do implement it, you need to use the super. You need to actually pass in whatever you're getting passed in from your base constructor. There is a lot of other methods, by the way, that we'll get into that it has. I'll just quickly touch on it. There is such thing as, again, we'll get into state later on. There's something called use state, and there's something called lifecycle hooks that basically when the component loads up, mounts, and unloads, you can tie into those using class components, which you don't have in a typical JavaScript function. You don't have state. You don't have lifecycle. It's just a function. So by default, that's why some people would go to class components. Functional and class components. Let me just give this pointer here. So the simplest way to define a component is to write a JavaScript function. This function is a valid React component because it accepts a single prop. We'll get into props and what that is. You can also use ES6 classes, like we said. So from React's point of view, these two are equivalent. Right now, if you look at these two, they do the same thing. Right, they do the same thing. There is, if you notice though, on the left, the functional component does take the props parameter in the constructor of the function, not the constructor. I'm sorry, in the function parameter list, right? And then through it, you have to use props dot, and you drill into it, and you return JSX. In this other side here, you notice that it by default it doesn't. You don't need to pass it into the constructor, right? Because by default it has props attached to it when you instantiate it. Basically, what it's coming from is when you are rendering your JSX, when you have an attribute, it'll automatically know and make React will make the relationship basically. And also, if you notice inside of the class component, there's that concept over here called this. Again, going back to ES6, we know that this is this class, this instance, and for however many multiple instances we might have, this is contained within the instance. It's again ES6 classes, which is why we spend a lot of time on those. Again, so now we're going back between we're also differentiating as well. So there's stateless and stateful. So another way of talking about a class that has a component that has state or it doesn't have state class components are always considered to be stateful, and components that have state get initialized in the constructor. And again, we talked already about the this keyword. So what that's saying is we can set our state up here like this. In our constructor, we set it up. So we want to use something at state called users. So we initialize it to empty array. So that means within this component now, users can be state can be updated. So it can change from an empty array to something that is whatever, populated. And some interesting things happen when we talk about state. We'll get into more of this, what happens within the components, but those are the difference there. Stateless components. All right, so stateless components again are just the functional components. Unless you need lifecycle hooks or stateless, you should always opt for these small functional components. If you have something like some type of I don't know, button that doesn't do anything, that just has an event on it, you just, maybe it's a sign up button, opt for functional components because they're easy to write, understand, very easy to test with such frameworks like Jest and all these things. And you can avoid the this keyword altogether. That this keyword is more code, right? You have to, every time you're working within a class component, you're talking about variables, you have to use that this keyword within it all over the place. But there's no functional components using one or the other if they don't have state, or they all transpile down to the same. So there's no difference. The only difference I could see is in the past is if people knew they might have to migrate all those functional components over the class, they might just say, hey, you know what, we're just going to do class components right out of the box, and that's all we're going to do. However, with the newer versions of React, you can actually migrate a lot faster because there's a lot of new features in there that you can use to make a functional component have state. Rendering that component, so when React sees that element, like we said, it needs to, number one, be Pascal cased with that capitalization on the front so it'll know what it is. It passes JSX attributes and children to the component as a single object. We call them props. So this is what we're talking about, props. And we'll get into that. And what that means is when you have an element and you have that attribute name, it's smart enough to know that that attribute name is a prop, and it'll basically make that relationship for you. All right, so we'll talk about props in just a second. I just wanted to quickly show something here. What was I going to show? All right, so this is a quick example here of, and let's make sure that I'm recording because that'd be very awful if I was not. So I'd have to do this all over again, which has happened. To be honest, it has actually happened a couple times. Um, and then I have to do a second go, and I don't like doing second goes. This is all in one take, so whatever happens, happens. All right, so basically we have a functional component here. It's just a function, and it's a tick function. And what we're just showing here is we are, what are we doing here? We have a tick function here. We have an element here. So we have this element that is JSX here, and we are going to render this element in the root tag, and we're going to tick every single time that we're doing it. Right, so we could do that. But what we could do is if we wanted to, I guess we could, we could take this element out, and we could, in theory, make an element, make the tick, we would call it, I don't know, we call it clock, right? We could have a clock component, and now we're actually going to maybe just extract all of that out of there. Let's see if we can do this. So we'll take all of this out like this, and we're going to cut this and put it inside the return. Live programming, let's see if it works. We don't need this element anymore, to be honest. Now we just have this tick, and now we have clock. So we have this functional component, and now we need to, JSX will be smart enough that if we do the bracket clock and close it up, it'll be smart enough that, cross our fingers, that it'll all render without error. Script error. Okay, what happened here? So it didn't actually like that for whatever reason. And you know what, the power of doing this is I can actually pause it and take a look instead of burning time here. All right, did you catch it? It's always the small things. The small things are always the thing that it's always the little things that matter. So I was missing a closing div tag here, which would make sense, right? I mean, you don't need to have an adjacent tag. You need to have you cannot have many adjacent tags. You need the parent container tag. So I was missing the closing block on my container. So basically what we did is we created this functional component. We took out the element directly and we called this tag here, which is a functional component. React knows to render this as a component. So it goes and looks up, because it's not lowercase like this, it is actually uppercase. It knows to go and transpile that down and look at the JSX and return it. And that's an example of a functional component. What you can also do is, remember, when you're rendering just UI, this is a bigger example. So this is a tic-tac-toe board, and this will just go through and show you how you can build out a UI with reusable pieces. So we have to start a square, and one square represents one of these numbers, and we pass in, again, because it's a class, we pass in the value of the prop, which is the number we could pass in, and we'll get the props in a second. I just want to show the fact that you can reuse this square. So we have, again, a board. So now we have the parent, which renders a square. So this is a function, and it will render as many squares as it has. I'm just trying to show how you can reuse components. So these are smaller components here. They're going to be rendered out in all these boards, all these numbers, each row. And we're reusing the same component by passing in the number 0, 1, 2, 3 all the way down. So we're reusing, each component is a piece of the board, and we're reusing it in something called, sorry, we have a square component. So we have 9 squares in the board. The board is the entire grid. And then we can also put that board inside of the game. So now we want to do this wrapper next player. So next player, we have JSX returned. We have the board in the middle, and we have some other things we might want to do. I think we want to actually put a message for if you win or lose. So now we have this game component, which is another container of the board and the game of the squares. And finally, down at the bottom, we render that finished game to React to mount into the root. So when you're just doing the visual UIs, like if you notice, there's not really any state being used here, but we are setting up this board to use state. And that's why all the class components are going to be used, because we want to track when we click, it turns to an X or a 0, and the next player goes, so we want to track that. So right now the visual elements, if it were just to maintain, it's just going to be in this way. We could have done a functional components just for this, but because we want to use state to track the player, not only the player but the X and O's, the state of the clicks, we would opt to use a class component. So that's why we would do that. All right, so we're going to look at the mighty props and understand why we would how we could use them. So props in React stands for properties, if you don't know. Properties to be passed around. So the props, the components are very useful if all we do are the same thing. If all we do is render the same thing. Actually, that doesn't make any sense, to be honest. They're not very useful if we just render the same thing over and over. That would be not very useful at all. But because we have this something called properties, we can pass them to the components. Uh, Again, with a syntax similar to HTML attributes, so we can pass them in to help create reusable components. Not only reusable components, we can have them talk to each other in a way that we can pass props to the JSX. So if we have on the side here, on this, I'll use my laser here. So this is the JSX or the HTML. We have a greeter tag, and we have this attribute called Al Pacino, right? Al Pacino. Now it'll do the reconciliation of what that is. It'll bind this name to the properties. So then when we have a class component, props can be accessed right away. So it knows when it instantiates this, it'll wire up this prop, and you can do destructuring to pull out name from this list of objects, or you could do this.props.name. And inside of the JSX, it'll evaluate the name, and it'll say, hello, Al Pacino, right? If you're doing a functional component, it would go inside of the parameter, the functional parameter call. Inside the function, where you pass parameters as you normally would a function, it will go in there. So one thing to know about props, this is what you need to know, is it goes downward. So when you're passing properties down through parent to child, it goes only in one way, and that's down. So number one, it works similar to HTML attributes. Data flows downward from parent to child. Unidirectional flow. You can't change props. They're read only. They're pure. You cannot reset them. That's one thing to know about them, right? That's why we may opt to use state, because state can change, but props just go down, and they're basically like, they are read-only. As you would have a functional, you would have, Java or C Sharp, object-oriented programming. When you pass in parameters to a method list, to a method, those are read-only. They're basically the parameters, the input parameters, and they are read-only, and this is the same what properties are. So conditional default props. So if the value, so this is just a little short form way of doing it. If the values is not passed in JSX, the component will be rendered without a value. You don't want that. You don't want it to be undefined. So you want to default it in this pattern. So in this pattern, you can just evaluate inside in your JSX. You can say this dot property is basically saying is that if it's undefined, if it's true, meaning again truthy in JavaScript, right? Truthy, can mean many things, but basically it evaluates if it's there. If it's something, then just show it. Otherwise, in this statement here, it says otherwise if nothing is there, then show world. So it's either there or it's not. If it's not, then show world. That's just a quick way of defaulting it. But you can also use default props, which is another thing, another great thing. So you can have a function and you can basically on the function default values for props. This is really great because if it's not defined, meaning if somebody uses your component and forgets and doesn't put that attribute on there, you don't want it rendering just saying hello, so you can default it in this way. So you can just say this is a greeting control, which is a class, and then I can specify that it's going to be greeter default props, that this name is going to be stranger. So if there's nothing there, it's going to say hello stranger. And basically what it's saying here is when I call it, and it's easy, somebody could totally forget. There's no if there's no markup, they could actually forget that there's values in there, and you don't want it rendering without a value. Or you do it this way, or you do it with the other way. How you do the or statement here as we default conditionally. Type checking, another thing as well, they have something called type checking. So when we talk about type checking, was kind of like we talk about, we go back to Angular and how it's so strongly typed with TypeScript, and some people really like it because of that, me included. I personally like that because I come from C# background, and I like when things are strongly typed. Makes me feel good that it can't change on me. And then when you go to JavaScript, you just got to get used to the fact that it's dynamic typing, and stuff happens. But there's a way that you can use type checking in this way. You can use prop types in the same way of defaults to make sure that this name is going to be a string, and you're basically enforcing that. Otherwise, you're going to get some type of validation error or something. But there are, again, with React, because you can pull in different, it's a library, and you can pull in different features. You can also pull in something, an extension like Flow or TypeScript that can be used to type check your whole application. So you can actually add those extensions on if you wanted to. Some people don't want to do that step, but you could do that. And just know that there's already some built-in type checking if you wanted to do something like that. Validation, again, we're getting into more on this prop type, so you can actually validate certain things. You can say that this is a required function, that this is any type is required. So you can actually, there's a list of validators if you so choose to use them. You can actually, so again, we're talking about props. We're talking about how we can extend props, prop types, validation, default values, and all those type of things. So it comes with a lot, to be honest, that you can use. So again, one more thing, JavaScript expressions as props. So this is what you need to know when you are passing it from JSX. This is important. You have to remember you have to use the curly braces. Within the curly braces in JSX, it's an expression. So you can do addition, subtraction, and whatnot. It'll evaluate down to the value. But if you are passing a value that you have defined, so here's a good example here. We have a functional component called number describer, and we have a local parameter called description that gets based on some condition. It's either bolded or not, and but in order to return in our JSX, we have to wrap it in the curly braces. I call it mustaches, and then down there it'll get evaluated. So it'll get evaluated. It'll see description. Okay, what is it? Go and evaluate that, and it'll find within the functional scope that it means something, and then whatever it means. So in this case, it could be bolded text, and just display that. One thing to note, and I always forget this when I look at this, is we, again, going back to that ES6 syntax that we learned, there's something called the spread attribute. It's those three dots. So, and you see this pattern everywhere. I even see it, the current workplace where I'm seeing it all the time. You can use that spread operator to pass the entire object in a way. So you can basically take all of it and pass it in instead of doing. So if you have here, for example, you have app one. So if you have two attributes, first name and last name, suppose you have, okay, so then app two, you set props to that, um, just the object, and then you do that curly braces dot 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 prop. So basically what's that going to do is it's when it gets evaluated, it's going to go and build out that whole list, that whole attribute list, without you having to do it. So you can imagine if you have an object that has maybe 100 attributes in there, you don't want to be sitting there typing first name, last name, home address, phone number, home phone, cell number, all this stuff. You want to just say dot 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 props and just trust the fact that it'll be spread out and passed all the way into that greeter function as on the property object, and you can dig into that there. So it saves a lot of time. That actually is the last slide. All right. I want to show two quick examples. Why not? While we're here, let's see quickly. I was going to take a look at, here we go. All right, so just to just quickly show some props here, give props. So here's a functional component, and all we do is to make some reusability out of this thing, we have three components, child components that are called welcome, and it's the same component, and we pass in the name three times. So we pass in view, which is the stepchild to Angular and React, and then we can basically call it three times. We could actually go walk up and do another 9 times if we wanted, right? We could go do that, and it should run and not fail. Let it chug. So it should actually do 9 components now. So we actually get a lot of usage out of this one functional component because it's reusable with this props.name. So that's a good example there. So this one here is, all right, before I already did that one, sorry. Just quickly show this before we go. This is a pretty cool feature. It's React Confetti. It has like a lot of nice stuff on it. Gravity recycling. What it's using is something called Particle library. But I just wanted to show this and not get into this. It has all the math functions, and all these are just pure JavaScript math. And there's a lot of it in there. You don't need to worry about that. We build up more. There's a lot of stuff with Particle. Okay, so forgive my scrolling here at the bottom here. We finally get to the React part of it. We're calling in all of those math functions. So we have prop types. So we're defining a lot of prop types. The style, it needs to be an object. The height needs to be a number. The width needs to be a number. All these types of things. So we got some stuff going on there. Prop types. We got some very good default props. Now I remember why I used this example, because it has all these defaults. So we have the default that if it's the window's undefined, then we're going to use the inner width of it. If it's not defined, otherwise 300 and 200. So we're defaulting all of these pieces here. We're defaulting the colors here, defaulting the wind and all this stuff. And then because we're using this class we're using a class component here. React Confetti extends. Now we have such thing as lifecycle events, like did it mount? If it did, then we're going to do something with it. If it it has will receive props, those are some extra, those are more advanced lifecycle features. Set a whole bunch of stuff up, then we render it. So we go through and render. We're using the spread operator here and passing in those, expanding out those past props, which just looks like a lot of them. And we're doing a bunch of stuff. And here we're rendering the canvas. And then we have another controller input. Now you don't need to know all this stuff. I'm just basically showing we have prop types, how a big piece of JavaScript might look. It's not very big, but so we finally get to the app, and we have the state, which is a class, and we have a bunch of events set up. And finally, what I was trying to get at now was just trying to show the components. So we have confetti, we have width and height being passed in as props. We have state being expanded out, so it's going to be expanded out to how many props are inside of state, how many attributes. And then we go ahead and we have a control input, and we're passing in all of the props here. You can see, right? There's not too many, there's 10. We have another control input that's a little different. So we're talking about these controls here, right? On these sliders here. And for how many slider here, like wind, we have about eight control inputs. So we're basically reusing them all. They all have different attributes and props. And basically after that, we're going to render it, and we're going to render the main app. So I just wanted to show here how you can reuse components, how you can pass in props, how when you need a reusable piece of UI, that you should create something that can be reused. And basically today we talked about components. We talked about functional components and class components, stateful versus stateless, and we talked about the mighty props and how we can tie it all together. So the next, what we're going to talk about is state, because we talked a lot about classes. So we're going to talk more about component state, how to set state, how to use lifecycle events and all these things, and kind of dig deeper into the fundamentals of React. All right, so I'll talk to you next time. All right, thanks.